Good afternoon, Einar Olsen. It's a pleasure to meet you face to face via Zoom. And I'm looking forward to being able to interview you this afternoon. Einar, could you introduce yourself for us?
Yes, I grew up in Ohio, in northeastern Ohio. My father was a municipal judge. My mother was a nurse. I had a typical upbringing, and I went to college in southwestern Indiana with 1 year in India. I majored in philosophy and religion, and I got involved in transcendental meditation. I spent half of my career in that and the other half in sales and marketing. I live in southeast Iowa with my wife, Mary Catherine, in Fairfield, Iowa, and we are dealing with, my main career has to do with meditation, but we're also dealing with 5G, and we just finished years of smart meter projects to reduce the effects of smart meter installation deployment by a major utility company.
All right. So, Einar, when we first spoke, you helped me understand a lot of things about the wireless issues and 5G that I found confusing. I've been reading a tremendous amount. I've been working a lot. We've shared various experts' knowledge around the country, and I still had a lot of confusion about it. It appears that what we're being told, what's being read in the news, is not necessarily exactly what is. I wondered if you could maybe talk a little bit about what you understand is actually happening with the wireless technology and 5G and what it is, since that would help people understand from the standpoint of their educational perspective.
Thank you, Kathleen. Just yesterday, I was reading a press release from T-Mobile, and it was so misleading about what's going on. So here's my take, but I need to preface this with, I'm not an expert. I shouldn't be taken to be an expert. I am an advocate. I'm a part-time advocate. And there are three general types of experts I rely on around the country. One are the engineers, the technically oriented people, and there are also many advocates who are also tech savvy. Secondly, there are the doctors and the nurses, the biology people. Then there's a small but significant group of people that are sort of a bridge who are becoming increasingly important, and those are the biologists who have both engineering and a biology training. So they're a subgroup, and then the third major group are the advocates who are not experts, and I'm in that group. So I rely on other experts for what I know. And the people who are more cutting edge that I'm familiar with now, in terms of what's happening around the country, are Orem Miller, who is a biologist in Los Angeles, and Daphne Tackover, who I haven't spent a lot of time studying, but I should. Orem strongly recommends Daphne. Of course, I've heard of her for years. Then thirdly, Paul McGavin in California. So to get right to your question, what we've been hearing about for at least 2 years, 5G, centers on millimeter waves. So when you bring up 5G to most people, they think in terms of millimeter waves or high frequency. It's either MM waves or milliwaves. We don't hear that phrase milliwaves as much as we used to, but a couple years ago, that was what we mainly heard, the term milliwaves. stands for millimeter waves. So I'm assuming that most of the people watching this will know what millimeter waves are. They're basically 20 gigahertz and above. And then there were associated technologies with the millimeter waves, such as poles or units, microcell towers, small towers, every 250 feet or so, and beams rather than blankets. Arthur Furstenberg's first big article years ago said from blankets to beams. That's on his website, cellphonetaskforce.org. And as usual, Arthur came out with this before just about anybody with a big blast of information that got everybody involved. So we've been hearing about this over and over, and there's countless videos, websites, all about 5G, equating 5G with millimeter waves. So to make a long story short, my understanding is that it's been deployed enough in the past year to show that it basically is not working very well at all. And so industry has made dramatic changes, but they're not really, for the most part, telling the public that they've made these changes. And so we have to learn from somebody other than the telecom companies what is going on. They're not showing that they've made it, that they've made dramatic changes, and they're not showing that the technology that they've been talking about for years isn't working very well. I'm not saying it's not working at all. So it was supposed to go 250 feet every 5 homes, having a unit, microcell unit, but it's only going 80 to 100 feet. That means to have complete coverage, you'd have to have a unit virtually every home in a normal or average residential area on both sides of the street. Okay. Now, there's 2 issues with this, big issues, which have canceled their plans over 95% of the country. The most obvious one is that it costs 10 times more. Okay, approximately. Instead of one pole on one side of the street every 5 homes, you've got just about every house on both sides of the street. So this is a huge cash, difference that they got to get from the banks. And of course, the banks aren't going to go for it. They're not going for it. But there's another hidden reason why it won't work, and that is this whole technology is mainly for data gathering, not communication. And savvy advocates, both engineers, biologists, and otherwise, we all know this now. And Tim Sheckley, in a forum here in Fairfield on the 1st of February, he's an engineer. He made this very clear. He said, cell phones are engineered to gather data, basically. They're basically data gathering devices when they do it by means of communication. So the problem is with that little coverage that they're not covering as well as they thought they would, they can't get enough data. Okay. It's not just they can't, otherwise they could be seen as a new toy where you could go outside and, do fast downloads. But, so I've seen 2 videos by tech analysts. One was selling investments and the other wasn't. He just did it for information for the public, for public information. And they both tried it out. They bought $1,200, $1,300, and $1,600 Samsung 5G phones. One went to Providence, Rhode Island. The other went to downtown Denver. They showed that if you're standing right underneath a unit, a 5G microcell unit, you can get just what they promised. You can get downloads in 30 seconds instead of 5 minutes. Say, for example, a long movie. Very flashy performance. But if they go They both walked. One of them walked about, I don't know, 100, 150 feet away, got no signal, with a clear line of sight, no leaves in the way. The other walked 60 paces away and sat down in a cafe right next to the window, no signal. So what that means is it's not, these 5G phones are not mobile devices. Okay, which is, pretty basic. You could maybe call them semi-mobile devices. They're more like toys where, it's like you can go out and play, but you can't really use them. And I had seen something of this in a New York Times article, I think it was New York Times, a couple months ago, about South Korea, which has put 5G in heavily, more heavily than any other country. And the person that wrote the article had interviewed two people who purchased 5G phones, and they both said when they're driving around the city, they go in and out of 5G areas. And when they go out, which they're mostly out, then their phone switches to 4G. They said basically they're not usable. So they just keep them on 4G. And so the system isn't really working. And it interviewed someone from industry over in South Korea who said, look, this is the first, we're 8 months into a 20-year plan. It's all going to work. It's just going to take time. The analyst who had gone to Providence, Brown University campus, said, they're going to have to put in a lot more microcell units for this to work. So I think, without knowing what's going on, it seems to me the industry is back to the drawing board, especially with regard to their economics. Like, what are we going to do? We need to stall for time. And in the meantime, they have to come up with something because they put in millions of dollars for purchasing spectrum. And they've also put in an enormous amount of money. And a lot of this is on loans that they've taken out that they have to pay back, with interest to the banks, I assume, without being an expert in it. So what they've come up with is that they are staying with the 5G terminology. They're still saying we're rolling out 5G, but they're not telling us that it's a different technology. And it is a different technology. So when 5G came into Fairfield, US Cellular did a press release all over Iowa, all over Wisconsin. And so they added these big arrays to 3 already existing towers that they owned. And then, we made a big fuss and they said, we're not going to do millimeter waves. We're going to do 5G. And I said, what? What do you mean? You're going to do 5G that's not millimeter waves. What does this mean? Of course, they didn't. And I wrote them. I wrote their attorney who was representing the president, who had sent a letter to our mayor. Of course, I didn't get a reply. They're not regulated except by the FCC, which is a joke. Pardon me, FCC, but that's the reality. So I had to find out. So I sent an email to several leading advocates who I often ask questions to. And one of them forwarded nobody knew. No one knew what this meant. This was only, 6 weeks ago. What does it mean to have 5G without millimeter waves? So one of the advocates forwarded my email to Orem Miller, the biobiologist in LA, who is respected. Dr. Mercola has featured him, and he's now really in demand around the country because turns out he knew. He knew exactly, fairly well what was going on, because he has gone to trade shows, industry trade shows for 2 years, tech shows, with the telecom booths, and talked to their engineers and asked them, what is this? So his understanding was much more sophisticated. And he basically said 3 technologies are being used and being called 5G. Modulation, frequency modulation, and the technical term is that he uses is QAM, which is quadrature amplitude modification. And he said he doesn't know what it is, and I certainly don't know what it is, but it's modulation. And he was very concerned about it. And so is Daphne, about the effects on health. And then there's pulsing, secondly, signal pulsing, and thirdly, there's the other one has slipped my mind, but pulsing modulation, oh yeah, carrier aggregation. I asked him, what is carrier aggregation? He said, look it up in Wikipedia. Do your homework. Well, it's very complicated, but it basically means, my understanding as a layman is that you are putting data on more than one frequency at a time. But don't quote me, although I'm making this video. I would refer everyone to Wikipedia and engineers to understand carrier aggregation. What's being discussed mostly is modulation because of its potential. Paul McGavin told me over a year ago, before any of this hit, it's the modulation that's wherever you have modulation, you're going to have potential lack of safety.
Can you explain modulation?
It's changing the, it would be best for you to interview Orem, but it's changing the wave pattern, the shape of the wave. And that's a very rudimentary, I'm not an engineer, that's a very rudimentary, simplistic explanation, description. So Orem said that these 3 things, and he sent an email around, it was a very long email, and it woke up advocacy all over the country. The leading advocates were saying, wow, this is a must read. And anybody can read this on his site. Just put Orem, O-R-A-M, Miller, Bowel Biology, you'll get his site. Click on 5G on the left-hand menu, and there you will have his long article, which he has revised since then. And he explains what what confused me, Kathleen, at first, before US Cellular announced that it wasn't going to do millimeter waves, is that they're right in their press release. It said, our 5G is going to be at 600 megahertz. Well, I'm not an expert engineer, but I know enough to know that 600 megahertz is not millimeter waves. It's not even close. So that's when I wondered, what is going on, that led me to ask the advocates what's happening. So as most of your people listening know, 600 megahertz, that's 4G LTE. You have 2G, 3G, 4G, and then 4G LTE is the next step. So here's my take on all this. You have 4G LTE, and then on the other end of the continuum, you have millimeter waves. Now, in between, there are these 3 technologies that are being used. You can call it 4G, you can call it, advanced LTE, you can call it 5G, you can call it anything. But it's just a matter of terminology. And so some of the companies are calling it LTE Advanced, Advanced Pro, LTE Advanced Pro, or A Pro. It's just marketing. And one of the main advocates in Maine, and also Tim Sheckley both told me what's called 5G is mostly smoke and mirrors. It's marketing terminology that sounds good because they've been pushing this 5G through marketing for years now, and I don't really see any demand. I don't know who is, this is one of the main things that advocates are asking. Who is asking for this? They're trying to hype up the desire and create the demand because the demand wasn't there. So it's marketing-based culture. And, you know, I don't go for that myself. I mean, it's natural. I'm a salesman. So they have shifted to this whole other technology that's based on modulation and calling it 5G. What this means is that the big technology shift or change was not into quote unquote 5G. It was from 4G LTE to LTE advanced. That was the fundamental tech shift. That's my understanding. And I may not be correct in that, but that's when they started the modulation and these other two. And what they're doing, of course, is proprietary. They won't tell you about modulation. They won't tell you about carrier aggregation. They won't tell you about pulsing. And each one has a different, probably different ways of going about it in different terms that they're using. It's fairly confusing. So they might be using the same terms for different things. They might be using different terms for the same thing. So what's needed are engineers to go out and try to figure out what's going on. But for the most part, according to Orem, what they're allowed to do is somewhat controlled by an organization or protocol called 3GPP. And this is getting into an area that I know very little about. But my understanding is that they have to do more or less the same thing at approximately the same times around the country. And I need to study this more. And I don't want to make any definitive statements, but 4G LTE or LTE advanced, in theory, should mean approximately the same thing to different companies at each stage. This 3GPP protocol institution is rolling these stages of communication out step by step. I think this is around step 10 or step 11. And they purchase, bands to work on, and they can be working on the same band, but doing different things. US Cellular and T-Mobile are both at 600 megahertz. So I don't know how that works because I thought they were supposed to purchase spectrums, but I know that what I'm saying, it could be raising more questions than giving answers, and it needs a lot of research and talking to more people and talking to more experts and people who are more expert than I am. And Orem would have more to say about this, and so would Daphna. So I'm just giving a very partially informed description of what's going on. So instead of getting high millimeter waves and microcell towers, here's the bottom line. Industry is pulling back big time. And the plans for towers every 5 homes have been mostly put on hold or scrapped. And everything that I read and everything that Orem sees says there aren't going to, with the exception, a couple of exceptions, which I'll mention in a second, there aren't going to be millimeter waves all over the United States, high frequency waves, for many years, if ever. And the New York Times published this on January 8th in a major piece with representatives of several or maybe all of the major telecoms, Verizon, T-Mobile, AT&T, Sprint, and US Cellular. Those are big five. And based on those interviews, the author of the article concluded that millimeter waves is going to stay limited for many years to densely populated environments, such as downtowns of major cities and stadiums. And those areas could be saturated. And the next step is to understand that Verizon is taking a unique position among the telecoms. They are focused on millimeter waves in these dense downtowns, basically catering to big business and the wealthy. And they'll go into wealthy neighborhoods that are adjacent and put in 5G. That's their marketing plan. Their marketing plan is fundamentally different from the other telecoms. So they aren't even doing the other, what's called low band 5G. As far as I know, they're only doing millimeter waves. Whereas US Cellular and T-Mobile, they're only doing, the low band. And we should mention, low band means 600 megahertz to 1 gigahertz. That's low band. Mid band is 1 to 6 gigahertz. Then we have a spectrum between 6 and 20 gigahertz that's not being used for 5G because it's really cluttered, packed with all kinds. If you go into the FCC website, it's amazing. You can see it's just crammed with every color of the rainbow, little box labeled in print, tiny print, what's that's being used for. So they have to clear that out before they make it available for 5G. At 6 to 20 megahertz, it's called unlicensed. It is licensed, but not for 5G. If that's the correct way of putting it, either that or it's not licensed at all. It's just occupied. So high band millimeter waves starts at 20, and it goes up to the highest number I've seen is 96 gigahertz. And those three bands, that's very basic, and anyone interested in 5G should understand those four bands: low band, mid band, unlicensed band, and high band. And it's the high band that's called millimeter waves. Now, here in Fairfield, we're getting a significant number of people who claim severe health complaints when this started. And this is going along with concerns that Orem and Daphne, I'm sure many other people have had about the effect of this modulation. So this big cutback to low band does not mean that it's safer. In fact, Orem gives some reasons why it might be less safe than 5G. 3 or 4 reasons, but we're at a pause now. I think I've answered your question, that we're dealing with a different animal in terms of the industry switching from millimeter waves basically to modulation. The next email I'm going to send out locally is going to say, goodbye millimeter waves, hello modulation. That's an oversimplification because modulation can be used along with the millimeter waves too. And that is what is dangerous. I'm going a little bit off topic, but in terms of your question, but Orem says, watch out. Why? Because industry is still putting towers all over the place. Why? If they're not going to do high band, why are they putting towers? Like every 5 houses, they're installing them a lot in California. Well, the speculation, because of course they're not telling us what they're doing, they're just saying they're for 5G. But the speculation is that they're going to use these for 4G, and 4G LTE and LTE advanced. And those are not beams. Those are blankets. And they're going to turn down the power. But that means we're going to be coded. Whoever's getting those towers is going to be coded by a whole nother layer of technology, of electrosmog, not just beams that probably won't hit you in a residential area. 5G beams, you're not highly likely to get hit by those beams if you don't have a 5G phone, if you're not, unless you're in a densely populated area. If you have a 5G, a millimeter wave unit in your front yard on your tree lawn, it's going to be going from the second story to phones around on your street as a beam, 2 to 15 degrees. What's the chances that you're going to be hit in your house and walking around in your yard? It's not very high. And out in the country, the chances that you would get hit by 5G beams is almost non-existent in the millimeter wave spectrum. But if they're not going to do the millimeter waves in that residential neighborhood, and they're going to do blanket every 5 houses, okay, that is could be considered less safe than the millimeter wave 5G, even though they've got the power turned down. So,
Einar, could I interrupt you for a second?
yeah.
One scientist who I spoke with said that all we need for communication with a cell phone is 0.1 watt.
Yeah, that was probably Paul.
Yes, and yet what he said was at these small base cell bases is that the wattage, the power, is between 7,000 to 10,000 watts, which obviously indicates that it has nothing to do with communication as
data.
from cell phone to cell phone, but what it does have to do with is collecting data from us, that whole surveillance aspect.
Right.
But my wonderment is because it's not a millimeter wave, and they obviously do not need that kind of wattage or that kind of power to break through the walls, because we understand millimeter waves have a difficult time going through trees and walls, which is one of the reasons why we've been told they need that kind of wattage. If they're not using millimeter waves and they're using 5G, a 4G, LTE or LTE advanced, my wonderment is that same kind of wattage going to be at those small base cells? Excuse me.
Well, yeah, that if they don't turn down, in theory, they're supposed to turn down the wattage. If they don't turn down the wattage and they have high power every 5 homes, it's not a good thing at all. It's a very bad situation, and that's why advocacy is needed. And that's the other thing we were going to talk about in this interview is advocacy.
How do you involve advocacy? I see in my own areas of working in New Mexico, which is where I'm living now. I'm also working with people in Oregon because I returned from Oregon not too long ago and lived there for a while and spent considerable time in Washington and have connections there. What I find in the various areas is that there appear to be just a handful of people that seem to be awakened to this. How do you develop How do you develop local advocacy when it appears so few people are actually aware of what is happening? And maybe you could address from your perspective, what it is about this lack of numbers of people who seem to understand what is going on.
Yes, what's needed is a professionalization of advocacy, a scientific approach to advocacy, which for the most part is missing, not only in this issue, but across the board in many issues. And from a sales and marketing perspective, sales and marketing experts, it's urgent for advocates to make use of professional sales and marketing knowledge, which is based on tens of thousands of scientific research studies in social science. Any social scientist who cares about this would look at the advocacy and cry about
Yes.
what's going on. And it boils down to two things. Who are you speaking with? And what are you saying? Okay. And advocates in most or all issues are caught up in their own selves, in their own opinions and their own feelings. And it doesn't work very well. When you're into marketing, what you do first is you mostly forget your own opinions and your own feelings. And you tune in and you survey the environment. Same thing with entrepreneurs, entrepreneurial activity. Advocacy is entrepreneurial activity being carried out for the most part in a very unprofessional, uneducated, uninformed manner in this and other issues around the United States and probably the world. So let me tell you a couple stories, vignettes, okay? I was getting interviewed by a TV reporter about 2 years ago. This was at our local senior center, and the Assistant Attorney General of Iowa was visiting and had just given a presentation, and the TV station had a reporter there, and she asked me to talk. So she's taping me and, interviewing me, and she looks really bored. Like, another day, another dollar. And so I was talking about health and the danger to health. And she obviously was not interested. And then at some point during the interview, about 10 or 15 minutes into the interview, well, 10 minutes, she suddenly something hit her, piqued her interest. And she looked at me, and all of a sudden it wasn't another day, another dollar. There was like this little window of interest. And she looked at me and she said, with a quizzical look on her face, sincerely, she said, "Why are they doing this?" This had to do with smart meters. Why are they doing this? Because I might have mentioned that smart meters offer no customer benefit whatsoever. There's nothing there for customers at all. There's claims, but nothing that's actually true or backed up or researched. So I replied, how about a $2.2 trillion data market? And it was like a bomb went off. Now I was speaking her language. I was talking about something that she cared about. And she got this look on her face like, oh, now I get it. Because, otherwise, talking about health, it's like trying to cram a round peg into a square hole.
Yeah.
Okay, and this is what advocates are trying to do all over the country.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying we shouldn't talk about health, but it's not working. As one famous advocate said in New Mexico, whom you know, the health argument against non-ionizing radiation has failed. It's as simple as that. So
Yeah.
we should keep mentioning it, but for whatever reason, this isn't about just what's technically true. There's another point here. What is strategically true? What is strategically effective? We have to tell the truth, but what aspect of the truth? There's a lot of things that are true. And what if people, let's just imagine you're selling bananas and someone comes up and says, well, you're selling fruit. And someone says, I want a banana. You say, would you like to buy an apple? You really should consider this apple. He said, but I want bananas. Okay, you can ask them if they want an apple like once or twice. My background is in sales. But if you keep trying to sell people apples when they're asking you for bananas, you're not going to make much money and you're not going to be very successful. And that's exactly what's happening around the country. And it's sad to look at this. And the other vignette was powerful for me. I wanted to stop. Well, the smart meter company, they came out with this proposal for an opt-out, which was, really ridiculous. I appreciate the fact that they offered us an opt-out without our even asking for it. But, well, I guess our mayor asked for it, our former mayor. But they had some bizarre requirements, such as we have to read our own meters and pay an opt-out fee. Okay, that's ridiculous. And we had 2 days a month window, the last 2 days of the month. And if we missed those readings 2 times in 12 months, we have a smart meter for life. Okay, so this is like weird. Like, how do we get rid of this? And so I wanted to talk to an attorney just to say, what are our options? And so I ended up with the city attorney because it was free. And he was very intelligent, but he wouldn't give us an appointment. And the second time we asked him, he said it was because some activists had made a presentation to city council and they had turned off the city council and him, and he didn't want anything to do with us. And so, health activists opposing smart meters. And so he wouldn't give us an appointment. We asked him twice. And then I happened to see him in the copy shop making copies for a lawsuit that he was involved in. And I just asked him, I knew him somewhat. And so he asked me for the third time, are you with that group, that activist group? I said, no. In fact, we have a somewhat adversarial relationship because they're saying a lot of things that aren't true. Like the opt-out meter is unsafe, whereas actually this digital opt-out meter, smart meter, had no SMPS, no switch power, so it had no dirty electricity. It couldn't, not anything of any significance. It was unusual opt-out meter. And so he gave me an appointment. And so we sat down with him and he asked us, the first thing he said, for the fourth time, he said, are you really sure, you're not fooling me, that you're really not with that group, the activists, the health activists? I said, no. He said, well, what would you like? And I said, well, we feel the opt-out proposal is unfair. And he said, why? He's very smart. He wanted to get right to the point. And he was respectful, but he wants to know what's our, tofu and potatoes. So I told him, I listed those points that I just told you. And he said, you need to politicize this. You need to go to city council. I said, what? He became an activist.
Wow. Wow.
because we're talking nuts and bolts.
Mhm.
Okay. And I thought, my God. Okay, so who do I talk to? So he said, talk to so-and-so, the chair of the committee, the city council committee. I said, okay. So I called him up and he called me back and he said, now, are you with this activist group? I said, no. He said, are you sure? You're not, trying to fool me. So, okay, so he made an appointment. So he went to the local cafe, which I'm going to get back to in a second. And what did he say at first? I just want to know for sure. Are you with that? Okay. This is like the 6th or 7th time. This is how traumatized they were by the activists talking health, 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 health. Now I'm a sales and marketing, pro, or at least was. Now I'm retired and I know what's going on. I can see it. The activists are not talking the right topic. And so what happened with this? It was amazing. He asked me to write it up. So I wrote up 2 pages and they they shepherded the whole thing through city council. I never even had a chance, I never even needed to make a speech. I never spoke to city council. They took it through and passed it unanimously. I just sat there. And one of the very few city councils in the United States wrote their own letter to the Public Utility Commission, the Iowa Utility Board, and said, please take our citizen concerns seriously. They didn't actually take a position, but they said, please take this seriously. And they put my letter in with their submission as an example. And I never asked them to do any of this. They did it from their side.
Wow.
And I put health in the letter at the end where it's most powerful. Every sales and marketing professional should know that the last sentence is the second most important sentence in the whole letter after the first sentence. And the second to the last sentence in any letter is the third most important, most powerful, effective. Okay, so that is a dramatic example of what it means to tune into other people. And you sent me an article from Nick Begich, or a video, where he's making this point, like, look me in the eye. Okay. So activists, ironically, you know who should watch that video? Activists should watch that video.
Well, I just want to make a comment. You were very fortunate that you were given an opt-out. I took a letter from my doctor to my local PUD and wanted to have my smart meter removed from my house. And they have said, no, we do not do any opt-outs, even with an MD's letter. And so I made an appointment with the chief executive officer, thinking about what you said and some of our conversations. And I'm going to sit across the table from him and I'm going to look him in the eye and I'm going to ask a whole lot of questions
Yes.
and find out what is it that here I am asking, as is my doctor, for an opt-out for very specific reasons. And I want to find out. And so I'm following that legacy that you have set up and that
So
Nick Begich talks about.
thank you. There's 2 points here. One is, what do you talk about? And the other is, how, where? Okay, these are 2 very different points. So we've covered one of those points, and that is health should be last and least as a topic to talk about when you're talking with anybody about 5G. Unless they have, and they tell you that they care about the health part of it. And I'm talking about policymakers and the general public, because it's just not working very well. The second point, though, is different, and that is, under what circumstances are you going to communicate with them? And all I read in the activist newsletters, so-and-so made a presentation to city council. So-and-so made a presentation to their state legislature. The question is, how much time did they spend before that presentation going out to lunch or tea or coffee or whatever in the local cafe? That is the key, because this is about getting to know one another, so that when you go to city council, you're not talking with strangers. You're talking with people who know you and hopefully will respect you. And when you first start talking to them, you know, talk about the weather, talk about their kids, where are they from? You know, this whole matter is a matter of community development. And this is fundamental to all issues, whether it's, well, I won't name all the other various issues, but because maybe some people have different opinions about different issues. But most people probably watching this are probably opposed to GMO food. Okay, so that's another issue. Or this issue or that issue. War, you know, we don't want war.
Drilling for gas and hydraulic fracturing, gold
Yeah,
mining. There are all kinds of extraction industries that are harmful.
yeah. So, I mean, I was thinking about vaccinations because
Yes, serious.
I have two friends who have PhDs, and they looked, we're off the subjects, they haven't been able to find a single study that shows that vaccinations are of benefit.
They
And
haven't
they
looked
know,
very hard.
well,
Oh, of benefit. Oh, okay. Yes.
of benefit of good studies. So getting back to the topic, if you want somebody to do something for you, get to know them. Get to know them as a person if you can. See if they'll go out to lunch with you one-on-one, or ask them how they would like to be approached. This is what I did with the city councilman, the chairman of the committee. I said, would you like, you know, several of us to come and speak with you, or you want one-on-one? Do you want to meet? Where would you like to meet? I let them decide and stay in their comfort zone. This is really important. And there's nothing unusual about what I'm saying, Kathleen. This is standard, ordinary sales. And, you know, it seems like when you look at advocacy around the United States, I don't see anybody with a sales background, you know.
Well, there's a lot of them and us. I mean, if we take a posture of them and us because we're trying to get something, the likelihood is there's going to be some resistance. And then we have to launch, a completely
Well,
different kind of campaign.
this is
But
all just standard sales and marketing. Yeah, you have your market, you know, and then how do you deal with your market? You know, and there's regulators that regulate your market. How do you deal with them? You go out to lunch with them, you know, or coffee or something. You go to a cafe, you just sit and talk and get to know each other a little bit and feel them out and see where they're coming from and how guarded they are. And you look at their body language. You know, there's umpteen hundred videotapes, TEDx talks, you know, on YouTube about all of these things. And they're,
you know, if I can interrupt you for a second, you know, it's as if differences are what divide. And I had a very dear friend. He died a few years ago, but he was a Woody Guthrie. You know, he was a wobbly supporter. I mean, he was a musician. He was a historian. He was so knowledgeable, educated, but he was very, very liberal in the sense of his thinking process. His best friend through his whole life was a scientist at the University of Washington who was a nuclear scientist who did detonations up in the Arctic. And they and Bob was very conservative and Urgel was very liberal. So, but that didn't get in their way of their heart connection. And
Yeah.
and they spent enormous amounts of time. They hiked the Olympic Peninsula together their entire adult years, and yet they had very strong differences in their own way of walking through life. And it reminds me of the Southwest Bean story of in the Pueblos, where the father and mother are in the kitchen with their daughter, and mother is making a meal, and the daughter needs to be distracted. And so the father takes a handful of beans and goes out with the daughter, and he says, "Oh, how would you make this village? What kind of people would you put into your village?" And he gives an example, and he has a wide array of different personalities. And then he says, "No, how would you do it?" And she picks out all the ones that want to play and, and do all the frivolous things. And he says, "But what happens when you need someone to cut the forest, the trees for firewood? What happens when you need someone to plow the fields?" And pretty soon she's picked all these other people, some who have personalities that are so counter to hers, and she has all of the beans in the circle just like her father did. And I think that's what we have to do today. We have to realize that everyone is of value. Everyone has that divine within. Everyone encompasses something about life that has something to contribute. But we have become so compartmentalized in how we look at the world, how we look at other people, that it's become very divisive. And
Okay, now,
it shattered us.
so this is very important to know how to deal with in two ways. The first is, what happens when someone gets into a public position in a government who does not have the appropriate skill set and is not open? You go out to lunch with them and they're just stonewalling you. The answer is simple. You vote them out. You vote them out. And it's urgent and fundamental that we need to have our attention on getting people into office locally. City councils, boards of supervisors and commissioners, state reps, state senators, who we know and we know that they're going to listen to us and do the best that they can. And for the most part, when I look around, I don't see that happening as much as it needs to, although I see it happening a lot more now than it was happening 3, 4, 5 years ago.
Yes.
We've got to get different people in office.
Well, I think
oh, go
ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
That's politics as usual. That's politics as usual. And of course, politics as usual isn't, just knocking on doors. Now it's social media. But nevertheless, that's one of the two things that I wanted to say about what you said about needing to be together as people more, is that even though we want to accept one another, we don't necessarily have to accept inappropriate or unmatched skill sets for different roles that people are playing in the government. So what were you going to say?
Well, I think what you're saying about the local participation is absolutely crucial. And that what it does is it takes our time. It's not so much social media anymore. It's not so much about clicking a thumbs up. It's about actually meeting with someone, looking in the eye. It's actually having a one-on-one interaction. It's no longer about a text. It's not about a cell phone. It's about one-on-one connection where we actually do have that relationship building. And without that, I don't think we have the capacity. Social media is lacking the heart. It's lacking the human component. And that's the direction that the whole wireless, the smart homes, the smart cities is taking us into artificial
Yeah.
intelligence and all
Right.
of the aspects that remove us from our humanity, from our humanness. And
This
so,
is being
go ahead.
discussed a lot. Uh, this dehumanization, depersonalization, desocialization. I agree with you. It's another topic. I know there's someone named Simon. I happen to know Simon Sinek, Sinek. He's done a number of TED Talks, TEDx talks on this, and there's many other people. I saw a long talk on this from, I think it was Daniel Goleman, kind of a psychology superstar. And it hit him like a ton of bricks one day when he was uh, got in a taxi, a van taxi, that holds like 6 or 7 people. This was on Cape Cod, and a bunch of co-eds came in with him. They didn't know him, and they had just gotten out of on a college break, and they were all friends, and they all got in together, and they started off driving, and they all went on their cell phones and didn't speak to one another for the whole trip. Okay. And he said, something's way off here. And Jordan Peterson's talking about it, and hundreds of people are talking about this. And I found personally that there's so much division sometimes between myself and others that I have to work through allies, mutual friends. You got to do what you got to do, because sometimes you get along better with somebody by email than you do in person, which is very unfortunate. But it's to have the desire to become more personal and to stay personal. That's the crucial thing. The direction. What direction do we want to go, instead of blindly uh, being socially engineered to by technocracy and technocrats and stuff and technology. We need to know where we want to go. And this brings up the second. What is our relationship with fellow advocates? Here in Fairfield, we've got 10,000 people and 5 groups. Okay.
Oh,
5 different groups because we can't get along with one another. And you know what the solution is, in my opinion? Science. Social science. Social scientists know how to address these situations, particularly community development. I'm not talking about group therapy, although that's valid, but I'm talking about various facilitation technologies. I recently read a small book called Dynamic Facilitation, which is a specifically branded technology of working with small groups, which is particularly open-ended form of small group facilitation. And the author listed over a dozen other technologies that are used for group facilitation with capital letters and acronyms and websites and everything. Social scientists know how to deal with this, but we need to be humble. We need to be humble enough as advocates to say, we need to learn something. We have something to learn here. Now, I majored in philosophy, okay? What did Hegel have to say about this, and Plato? It's called the dialectic. Have you heard that word?
yes.
Yes. So Plato says synthesis, antithesis, thesis, antithesis, synthesis. You have a certain statement or position or action. It creates its own opposite, it has a tendency to create its own opposite. That's called the antithesis. Someone says ABC, it tends to elicit XYZ. Then those two combine through interaction, through back and forth. War is a form of synthesizing, for example. There's an interaction between two different situations, resulting in the third component, which is a synthesis, which becomes the next thesis. And so if you keep up the communication with a desire, with humility and receptivity, then what happens is we don't get as isolated, because it's isolation that leads to war and conflict. When there's a lack of communication, then there's repression, and then that tends to create sudden, disorderly interaction, such as fighting or war, or my city council telling me, 8 times that they don't want to talk to me. So communication, appropriate communication, is the way to enhance the dialectic. The dialectic is neither good nor bad. As Hegel pointed out, it's everywhere. Hegel took what Plato said and said, this is one way to look at everything, is the dialectic, every little moment. In fact, it's good not to get caught up in terms of thinking about the dialectic too much, but we need to realize that the activism and advocacy about 5G is the kind of the mere opposite, mirror, mirror opposite of the technocrats, and they're both talking at each other.
Yeah.
And what's needed is a lot of the things you've been saying, Kathleen, about connecting as human beings. And when I talk to a lot of advocates about this, I get nowhere. And they can say, no, you don't understand. My health is in danger, and so on. Well, look for another advocate to talk with. And things are changing. I talked with 2 advocates last week, major. Both of them are very influential. They said, I'm beginning to see that we need to bring in privacy more, and not just talk about health. We need to go in that direction. And it's crucial, to the point that you brought up, to understand that privacy concerns, Kathleen. I mean, this has just exploded in the United States culturally. And all of a sudden, our whole mainstream is deeply concerned. So are we going to talk to them about what they're deeply concerned about? Or are we going to talk to them about something that they actually don't care about? A year ago, they didn't care about privacy either. But all of a sudden, I could give you several examples. I'll give you 2 examples. Well, 3. New York Times expose a couple weeks ago. 0 privacy. Every cell phone in the United States is tracked, at least when it's on, and maybe 24/7. And it's recorded, and there's a record and a database for everything. And it wasn't as much of it was a twisted expose. I mean, what do you expect? Because they claimed that the government was not involved and we need more regulation. It was a twisted kind of expose, but it was half true, and it was showing that public opinion about privacy is now so huge that they cannot ignore it. They have to pick it up and make it their own and do what they want with it. I'm talking about the mainstream media and the powers that be. And so now they're trying to, do a jujitsu and make us believe that the government is not involved and not getting that data, and only private corporations are.
As if that makes a difference.
Well, it's basically the same group of people. And secondly, another anecdote about this was, I was at a table at a Rotary Club for a 5G presentation. I got invited to Rotary by that city council person, by the way. And I was sitting at the table with the person that was making the presentation, who was a local expert in communications technology. And his daughter was there with her husband. And his daughter, was the editor of a a magazine having to do with wireless communication. And she said, our demographic are highly concerned about privacy. Very, very concerned. I said, who's your demographic? And she said, boomer males. And most of the discussion at the table before his presentation centered on privacy. Everyone was really concerned about it. And if I started talking about health, they weren't even comfortable with the topic. So what are we going to talk about? Now, the third, as advocates, the third point.
Before you go into that, I want to just mention, I saw a little clip on an interview where a person was talking to Biden about 5G at one of the rallies. And
Yeah,
she was going on, and he acknowledged it. And right when the video cut off, he said, but what really gets me is the surveillance. And then it cut off. And I thought,
yeah.
wow, we need to we need to really push that element, because it obviously has the attention of presidential candidates.
Yes. Well, I have a friend who spoke at length with Joe Biden about this.
Uh-huh.
He said the same. Oh, I don't remember if he spoke about privacy, but he spoke at length with Joe Biden about it. And Biden said, I think what he did is he gave him the Scientific American article by Joe
Oh.
Moskowitz. And Biden said, yes, I've been reading about this. And it's everywhere. A major public official in our town went to a local 30 minutes away, another town, which is known for being particularly conventional. And she was in a meeting with about 25 people. And she brought this up, 5G and privacy and cell phones, because she had just purchased a cell phone that she could not turn off. And this was freaking her out. And she's not particularly interested in the health argument against wireless radiation. She said every single person in that meeting was very concerned about privacy. This has gone everywhere. And we, as advocates, we need to hop on this. And another thing that happened with the same city council person that I've been speaking with a lot, when I speak about health, it just goes around in circles. I've given him my best data, emf-portal.org, 30,000 studies, over 30,000, 30,500 studies almost, 429 last time I looked, a couple days ago. By all estimates, which I won't go into detail, about 2/3 of those studies show harm. That's an estimate, very approximate estimate. That's 20,000 studies approximately. Do we really need to know more, okay, than 20,000 studies? But it just doesn't go anywhere when I try to talk with him. And so I sent him the New York Times article on privacy. And he says, this country is really screwed up. It hits him so hard. So come on, advocates, let's shift. Tim Sheckley was here. He sent me an email and said, we should not allow ourselves to get drawn too far into the health argument. And, I feel we should let the doctors and the scientists deal with the health argument. That is their profession. It's a long-term project. Another way to put this, Kathleen, is that what are we really trying to do? What's our goal? Is it to stop 5G, or is it to persuade America that non-ionizing radiation is harmful to health? Okay, we need to, and those are not the same two projects. Let the doctors take the second. We need to do the first. And it doesn't, when Tim mentioned his main points to me, he put health last. He said, yes, we need to discuss it. We need to address it. We should not ignore it. But the best way to do it is just to do it briefly and say, how about 20,000 studies that show harm, and just leave it at that. Leave it as a question.
So then, Einar, we take on the issue of surveillance or privacy, data collecting, which I tend to agree with you. It has the most teeth to it. What salient entry points? I mean, first we have to find an audience to listen to this. That when we do, what do we say? I mean, from your perspective,
Okay.
what do you
Here's the basic point, Kathleen. It's not what do we say.
It's what we
It's
ask.
Oh, that was good. Good,
Oh.
Kathleen. Good. Yes, that is the basis of sales and persuasion and leadership and management, is asking questions and listening first, at least, mainly. So you'd ask them how they feel. How do you feel about this? How do you feel about the privacy? And on that basis, you can give them information. Here's the basic, I call it sutra. That's a Sanskrit word. It means, a little aphorism. Questions open the mind. Statements close the mind. They focus the mind. Questions open the heart. Everyone likes to have their opinion asked. Everyone likes to give their opinions. Okay. People like to be asked questions. What do you think about this? We fantasize all day long about telling people what we think.
That's true.
We all do this. We don't fantasize usually about asking all people questions. We fantasize about talking to groups of people and talking to people we care about and telling our opinions. And so what touches people and starts communication interaction is when we ask them how they feel. And then on that basis, then you can, give them some information. And when you give them the information, you can say, does it would 20,000 studies make any difference to you? If you're talking about health, or if privacy, say, instead of saying, yes, but there was an article in the New York Times. No, you say, did you hear about the article in the New York Times? There's a big, big difference between making statements and asking questions. And as you say, staying in the heart, pausing, listening, waiting. Not being in a mode of trying to get that next piece of information out because maybe they're not ready. It's like trying to cram food down a baby mouth who is still chewing, they're still chewing, so you don't try to keep sticking the spoon in their mouth. You got to give them time for them to digest it. And, if you send it by email, give them time to deal with it. In sales, one of the most important things, and it's very underestimated and under taught, how to set a callback date. How long to give someone before you get back in touch with them. This is a very important skill. It takes intuition and feeling and calculation. And because if you get back to them too soon, hey, you're rushing me. If you get back to them too late, they say, I already bought for somebody else. Like, oh yeah, I remember vaguely talking to you. So you want to be cautious about the callback time, the so-called callback time, how long you give people before you get back to them, if they're a public official, city council person, media, whoever. And, there's databases for this. And advocates could use databases like that. All this is sales and marketing. And any applications, computer applications for sales and marketing, they're all applicable to our advocacy. It's all part of the first thing that I said, professionalization of advocacy. And what I would recommend to every advocate for 5G, find several sales and marketing pros and just sit down and ask them what they would do, how to approach this. What do you think? And learn from them and be humble and ask questions and learn and grow, because this is a lesson for advocates to become, to do community development. This is all a community development topic in terms of social science. And as I said, it's community development is like a foundation beneath everything we've said this afternoon, and anything we could say about GMO, and anything we could say about vaccinations, or anything we could say about fracking, or about war. No matter what the topic is, community development is underneath that. And what is the core of community development? Well, one of the components of that core is food. Is eating together. It's not just talking, it's eating together. My father, I'll never forget, he told me the best time for an appointment is 1 o'clock.
Oh, perfect. That's the time of my appointment with the PUD.
Yeah,
Maybe I
because it's
intuitively do that.
after it's right after they've eaten. you know it's the best time, other than America does its business over the napkins. You go out to lunch with people. America's business runs by napkins. What's written on the napkin, and that's the way it is. And that's what business people know, entrepreneurs and salespeople. That's where the decisions are made. And that's what, unfortunately, it's all cocktail parties is another big one. That's where you go and connect. Now, if you don't drink, you can't get anywhere in America. And if you don't use a cell phone and you don't drink, you're left with like my life. But that's what we have to work with. And we need, this is a chance, this 5G, to redo all issues. They're a chance to get back to the basics of human life that you were talking about before. And this brings up another point, which is obvious through the last half hour. We need to have less attention on who gets elected president and more attention on who gets elected to city council. There needs to be a balance on the levels of governance. An integrated citizen or resident of any country is best functional if they have their attention and their activity and their projects in a balanced distribution of the levels of governance, with our attention somewhat on the country, somewhat on the state, somewhat on the region, somewhat on the county, somewhat on the city, somewhat on the neighborhood, and then our families, and then our partners, and then ourselves. And then there's nature, of course. These are all the levels of our life, from microcosm to macrocosm. And if we start to get too much attention on one or two of those levels and not enough on the others, then there starts to be imbalance. And one of the unsafeties in our country right now is that there is way too much attention on the single leader model and on the national and international level, particularly on the national level, as though if we elect somebody different as president, it's going to change it all, magically change it all.
Well, if I could interject there, I would do just the inverse of your list, and I would say it begins with the self. And I think that's where you were going with that anyway. But it's all about self-empowerment. And if we don't recognize that our power is within, and yet we have been programmed those first 7 years of our life that everything exists outside of ourselves, which it did. But as we become conscious and we begin to take back our power or recognize our power, then we actually have a way to be able to make change. But if we are constantly looking outwardly, we have no chance for change. So I see this whole issue with wireless and 5G as a very significant spiritual possibility of evolving spiritually by recognizing our internal power and using that on the local level. And I don't see the state or the federal level of government as having anything to do with serving us in our own lives. In fact, the rules, the regulations, the laws really have been put in place through the corporations that have been in place since the middle 1800s. They put their government officials in office to be able to do their bidding, and then we are left on the local level
They're
within
bidding.
our
That's
own.
interesting.
That's
They're bidding
right.
Joseph Biddle. Have you heard him?
No, I haven't.
Well, he was the guy that Andrew Jackson was fighting, who's trying to represent. Biddle was the inheritor of Alexander Hamilton's central banking. He was the head of the central banking at that time that Hamilton had set up, and Jackson was fighting Biddle. But that was just a funny comment on what you said about bidding. It kind of hit me. But could I
Well,
say something about this
sure,
that you?
please
Yeah,
do, and then we'll wrap
just
up.
just before we started this interview, I had purchased a bunch of CDs at our local secondhand store, and so the CD I had was it was in a cardboard cover, and I was just going through them, and this was Joseph Haydn, okay,
Oh, nice.
the composer. So I took the CD out, and I didn't look at it, and I put it in the computer, and then I looked at my screen, and I looked at the playlist, and it were these names, like Stand Up and Fight, and I thought, wait a minute,
It was not Haydn.
it was Bob Marley.
Oh, how cool. I like
Okay.
him even better. Or
And
as much.
so the reason I brought Bob Marley up, it was his best hits, and so was because I spent most of my life thinking that it was basically based in the self. And now, to some extent, I've changed my mind. And now I say, I don't want to uh, I want to keep a balance within myself between inward and outward. I spent most of my life focusing on inward and thinking that was the key. But it's often through our relationships and interactions that we can learn about ourselves and grow ourselves. And so I'm sort of losing my prejudice or bias towards inwardness and self-referral and subjectivity, and feeling that, we need a balance between looking to ourselves and addressing our city council. All those activities are important for a healthy, well-balanced life. But the situation is that we're growing up in a time where the self was neglected. And so when something's neglected, then you want to dive for it and say, this is important, this is the key. But the reason it seems like a key is because it's been missing. And it's important not to overemphasize. I was reading the article, it's an excellent article on New Age in Wikipedia. They have a big, long article on the New Age movement. And it's generally known as being self-absorbed and too much attention on the self. And this is that dialectic we were talking about. It's a counter, it's the antithesis of this object referral. And so it's too much the other way. And this is the dialectic that we're working out between the object referral establishment and the subject referral counterculture. And what's needed is an integration of the two, so that we add that self-referral, but we don't go too far in the other direction. And that's what's going to stop 5G, and that's to me what spirituality is about. And you're right. This is a spiritual endeavor, and it's also a community endeavor. It's a political endeavor. It's all of these things. And it would be healthy for advocates to realize this and not just keep focused only on, you know, the externalized advocacy points of knowledge and this knowledge and that knowledge and this knowledge. It's also about who we are and what we're up to, and how can social science inform our advocacy, and how does our advocacy fit into our lives and our communities. I guess I'm kind of summarizing the time we spent together this afternoon, which I enjoyed.
Thank you, me too. Go ahead.
Well, I don't have anything else to say right now.
Well, you were saying this is about who we are and what we're up to, and how can the social sciences be
Well,
used.
everything in our life is related. And I talked to an advocate once, not for very long. She was in a frenzy. She kept telling me, I didn't even take a shower this morning. I haven't eaten. And I've talked to more than one advocate in that kind of a state. It's not the best or most successful place to be. And spiritual knowledge is that there is a spiritual knowledge that says that whatever is happening is due to what we have sown. As we sow, so shall we reap. This is a spiritual principle. It's the law of karma. And, that was coming out of Palestine, but it's all over Indian tradition. It's the same principle. That means if this is happening to us from the holistic, unified point of view, we have deserved it. We have done something in the past to bring this on to ourselves. We're responsible for what our experiences are. So if we stay focused on it's somebody else's fault, that's not really spiritually valid. Yes, it's someone else is responsible on one level, but from another point of view, we're responsible. And from a third point of view, we're both responsible. So we need to keep up our advocacy, and the competition doesn't go away, but there also is a self-referral value here of humility and receptivity where we have something to learn as well.
Thank you, Einar. I appreciate your knowledge, your concepts, your heart, your experience, and all of this. It's a this whole experience that we're having. Jung said that what we don't own and take
Right.
in, it becomes an event outside of us.
It's every email that you send. It's on every email you send.
It is. It's a reminder. It's a reminder that we, and it is a summary of what you just said as well.
Yes.
That we truly are responsible for the whole. We are part of the whole. We have a part in how we respond, how we control ourselves, how we think, how we feel, and this is an opportunity for us to recognize our empowerment, to recognize and be humble, and recognize the power of others, and through that, I think we can find a way. It is a very big experience for all of us.
It's a process of integration, because if we get too much caught into the spiritual point of view, there's many people talking now in the spiritual circles of how this can be paralyzing, that we can use spiritual principles to not act, such as the phrase that a lot of young people are saying, it's all good. If we get there's two basic principles. One is the sort of holistic spiritual kind of principle, like, oh, it's all happening because we deserve it. And the other principle is, go for it. Go out and stop 5G, make it happen. These two points of view need to be balanced and integrated. We shouldn't get so much into that holistic point of view that we lose our intensity of advocacy. We just need to be a little bit less attached to the fruits of the outcome. And, you know, that's a basic principle, but we shouldn't be so unattached that we become passive or passe about what's happening to us. We need to engage in what we're doing to stop and limit 5G as much as we can. But that could be integrated in a way that's to our benefit by this broader perspective that's less emotional and more rational. You know, and that rationality is what leads us to social science and more effective professionalization in sales, applying sales and marketing knowledge to helping us achieve our goals.
Thank you. Yes, and I think, you know, it all takes balance. We see that in nature. Nature is constantly in a state of balance. There's
Yeah,
chaos within all of
homeostasis.
that. Pardon?
Homeostasis.
Homeostasis. And anytime we as an individual are out of balance, we are out of balance. So that means that how we interact with everything else in our life becomes out of balance. So it's truly about becoming centered and acting and understanding our integrity and what this life in this human body is about. And it
Yeah,
is about speaking up for those who have no voice. It's taking care of our environment, of which we are an integral part, and it is understanding what is, you know, when it's correct to take action. As you
yes,
said, if we vote out a politician, we put someone else in who represents the good. And there is a difference between good and evil. And I have come to realize that through this process, and it's been very eye-opening. So unless, do you have any other closing words? Otherwise, I would say thank you.
thank you, Kathleen.
Appreciate it, Einar. Take good care.
Same to you.